All right, we're going to talk about the results of the elections to the Israeli Knesset, their version of the parliament that just happened a few days ago, a couple of days ago. And we're going to talk about it because some people don't understand why the Israeli Palestine problem is insoluble. And some people get fooled into thinking that this thing is going to be solved or can be solved. So, what we're going to do is we're going to look at these election results, and I'm going to give you my interpretation, which is not authoritative but may be interesting to you, about what kind of parties get elected in Israel. First, brief background on this. In the United States and in many countries that you may be familiar with, we have electoral institutions with single member districts, which are, for example, the House of Representatives elections to the American House of Representatives, Congress, the lower chamber, the lower house, in which you live in a congressional district, you cast your vote, and one person is elected from that congressional district. Those are single member districts. In other countries, they have different rules. For example, some district might elect 2 people, or the entire country might be one district and you elect 600 people. Everybody votes. We divide up the votes amongst different parties or candidates that receive ballots cast in their favor, and then it gets apportioned that way. But needless to say, in America and in Britain, you have anywhere in America you have 2 parties. In Britain you have something like 2.4. You get the Conservatives, Labor, and the Lib Dems. In Israel, the electoral institutions are set up in such a way that it promotes parties. So in Israel, there are many parties, and those many parties represent different political positions. It's very easy in Israel to get yourself onto the ballot, and if you have an interesting idea or if you're famous, you can perhaps win a seat to the Knesset in a way that would never happen in America or Britain without the support or the party label of a main party. In Israel, the same barriers aren't there, so you have many parties. So even the leading parties in Israel are not really parties, they're more like coalitions or alliances of smaller groups. So Benjamin Netanyahu is of the Likud group or the Likud party, but his challenger, who we thought might win this time, Benjamin Gantz, whatever it is, his group is called Blue and White, and it's composed of, I think, three actual parties within that group or alliance. So this is just the institutional background on why in America you get 2 parties plus a few independents. In Britain you get 3 parties, whereas in Israel you might have 10 or 15 parties sitting in their parliament at one time. It's all about the electoral institutions. In Europe, they often use these kind of rules because they have the idea that if you get everybody's opinion represented, then democracy will work better. So you have 6 parties in parliament rather than 2 in the United States. In the United States, the competing theory is that the competition between the 2 parties will push those 2 parties towards representing a larger number of people, or it will push the extremists away, and then you'll get some kind of centrist opinions that will represent the will of the people, so defined. Now, my opinion is that all of this stuff is pretty much a smokescreen anyway, and all of this stuff about liberal democracy is kind of foolish. It doesn't really work in practice. It doesn't matter if you have 2 parties, 2.4 parties, or 15 parties. In all cases, it is still an oligarchic elite of financial people, media people, academics, and a few others. Throw in whoever you'd like. They're calling the shots, and the electoral institutions and the number of parties isn't really that important. Whether the United States has a Democratic Party with a strong green or ecological constituency, or whether you're in Germany and the Greens have their own party, doesn't really matter because whoever's representing that stuff is going to get co-opted anyway by the elites. So you don't get what you want through either of these democratic theories, for instance. That's my criticism, and that's what I've come to over a long period of time. But let's talk about what we got from this election to the Knesset. So what I did was I took the list of the major parties or major party groups, and I classified them according to the different categories that I think they occupy. So what we're going to do is we're going to start on the far right column over there where it starts with Arab and far left. We're going to start at the bottom and work back. It's appropriate because in Hebrew everything is inverted. You start on the right and then read left rather than left to right like we do. Pardon me. So the first party is Meretz, and they got 5 seats, and I classified them as far left because their constituency, their platform is feminism, the environment, just all this kind of stuff that you would see in the far left of the Democratic Party in the United States, or just really the non-neoliberals in the Democratic Party. That's what they represent, and that only got 5 seats out of 120. So pretty small group. Pretty small group in Israel is interested in feminism and ecology and all this kind of stuff. Now the Arabs have these 2 different groupings, which each have 2 parties in them, but total they got 10 seats. So 10 out of 120. So pretty small numbers there. Now the other 115 seats in the Israeli Knesset, their parliament, are represented by what we would kind of think as rightist parties. And what I mean by rightist is they're all nationalists. They're all Zionists. So they disagree about economics and they disagree about foreign policy, and they quite often disagree about the integration of religion into civil society. Some of these parties are atheistic and secular, so they don't think that religion should play a large role. They would define the Jew as being a cultural, historical, genetic thing, and not so much a religious thing. So they would see the Jews coming down through history as being traditions and shared descent. Whereas other of these parties think that Judaism is something that was given to a historical people, that these folks are the heir to it, and that what they received from God was a bunch of religious commandments that they later then enhanced upon and added to through their rabbinic Talmudic tradition. And we won't get into the implications of that, what you got from God as opposed to what you created yourselves. That's a huge can of worms that we're not going to get into. But needless to say, that's the central division between all of these different groups. The economic component, let's start at the top here. So Benjamin Netanyahu and his Likud people originally started out more towards the left on economics, but Netanyahu is kind of like I've heard him described as a Ronald Reagan of Israel. So he's pushing this classic conservative, we need a smaller government, we need smaller taxes, we need to denationalize our national industries, we need to put things in private hands. So sort of a libertarian conservative type of vision there. It's not very popular. It's not very popular in terms of where the basic Israeli public sits. Most of them, as we will see in these other groups, are firmly in the socialist or social nationalist or national socialist camps. And even Netanyahu taking this kind of position is, something fairly innovative for Israeli politics. They've never really done that before. All right. So we'll go back to the bottom here under social nationalism. There are two parties that are leftist in terms of economics. They would probably want what any of your basic European democratic socialist parties would want. Heavy government involvement and regulation in all major industries and minor industries as well. A large social safety net for individuals, and more secular and less role for religion in public life. And so, without the religious component, I think you could aptly describe that as social nationalism, because even these parties, even Labor and Kulanu, are totally Zionist. Totally Zionist. And what we mean by Zionist is that Israel must be a Jewish state. And what everybody, of course, is going to have a different interpretation of what that means. How do you make sure that Israel remains a Jewish state? And you can argue about that till the cows come home, but the very simple and most direct interpretation of it is that this will be a state run by Jews for Jews. And, we don't need to get into anything really beyond that. And you can kind of see how much further to the right this is than American politics, because these are the kind of people who would be in the place, we'll say, of like the Democratic Party in America. But for the Democratic Party in America to come out and say, we're going to run America for Americans only, and Americans will determine what goes on in America. I don't think the Democratic Party would say that. It's too nationalist for them. And these guys, these people, are even further to the right than the civic nationalists, because they're not saying that Israel is a state for the Druze and the Arabs or the Christians. It's a Jewish state. It's a state for Jews, by Jews, run by Jews, started by Jews, etc., etc. So even when their economic policies tend toward leftism, or what I would describe as leftist economic policies, they are firmly nationalist anyway. So that's Labor and Kulanu. 10 seats, okay? Only 10. So we're still not really in the major groupings yet here. We're still kind of on the fringe. And historically, Labor, they produced the prime ministers. They produced large parliamentary blocks, but no longer. Now, the next two is Yisrael Beitenu. I don't know how to pronounce that, but Israel Beitenu, Lieberman's party, Avigdor Lieberman's party, and then Benny Gantz's Blue and White party. I think both of these parties are National Socialist parties, exactly modeled after probably traditional Labor Party. They're probably sitting where Labor was 30 years ago. But they're pretty much identical with what I think the Hitlerite regime was doing in Germany in the 1930s. They believe in a large social safety net. They believe in the straightforward Zionism that we talked about earlier, and they are aggressive, and they will die for what they believe in. And what they believe in is an ethno-state for Jews and by Jews. So what separates them from people who are further to the right is that they are more willing to compromise on the vision that the people further to the right have of them. So they're not as interested in carrying this idea to its furthest possible conclusions. And just having the idea that you want to live in a state full of people who are just like yourself, and you're going to take care of them, and you're going to get along with them, and if anybody bothers you, you're going to attack them viciously. That's an idea that healthy people should be attracted to. Should be. And so the leader of the Benny Gantz grouping, or Benny Gantz's grouping, he's a former military man, so he's saying, I can deliver on this stuff because I've killed people, and I've ordered my soldiers to kill people to protect our nation. So that's where he's sitting. Now, once we go to the right of this, we're gonna and I'm sorry, and I think that the National Socialism is most clear in Avigdor Lieberman's group because they are totally secular. They don't really see a big role for religion, and so therefore they completely embody the ethnos, the cultural and tradition and descent, the genetic descent from these people. That's what binds them together. It's not Judaism as religion; it's Judaism as ethnos. All right, and then the far right people here, what I've called the supremacist groupings. This is Netanyahu's Likudniks people. The Likudniks, the Likud party, are the biggest grouping. And you know what Netanyahu does is appeal to. He appeals to Jews who see what he's done in practice rather than his ideology, because I think ideologically it's kind of muddled. It's not really clear, but they look and see what he's done over the past, which is attack Israel's like client state in Gaza and the West Bank when necessary, attack their neighbors to the north, threaten to attack Iran. So he's got this bellicose quality. He's pro-settler. He, right before the election, said that they were going to annex some of the Arab occupied territory that they've got nearby if he gets reelected. So I don't know that it's so much ideology as it is carrying out a certain program. And that program you can find in a document written by a fellow called Oded Yanon that goes back to Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was one of these secular atheist Zionists from the early part of the 20th century, who said that the state that they envision will go from the Nile to the Euphrates, and whoever's there, we're going to get rid of them, not necessarily through genocide, but through forced population exchanges. So they want to clear out all of this territory and establish a state occupied by Jews that is greater than modern day Israel. And so the people who support that kind of notion, I think, like Netanyahu and vote for Netanyahu because they have evidence that he has been carrying out that program through settlement and through their bellicosity, and that if they vote for him, then they'll get that. And then this weird, like neoliberal small taxes, privatizing government-owned industries. That I don't really know how that fits in, but that's the neoliberal aspect. The other big part of this supremacist grouping is the two Orthodox parties, which are Shas and United Torah Judaism. Shas with 8 seats and United Torah Judaism with 7. These are the Orthodox Jewish people, the Haredi or the ultra-Orthodox or however you want to call them, I don't know. I think United Torah Judaism represents the Ashkenazi, and Shas is more of the Sephardic and the Mizrahi people. But both of those are just pretty basic political implementation of Orthodox Judaism. And so to the extent that Orthodox Judaism is an ethnic supremacist doctrine, which I believe that it is, and I don't really think it's capable of being argued with starting out with the texts as the center of the argument and then moving out from there and seeing what does the text say and then how did they behave in practice, not really looking at their apologists and their PR stuff, but what does the text say and then how do they behave. I think it's pretty clear that it's ethnic supremacy, and that's who is being represented by those two parties, is people who believe in that. And the thing is, they get along really well with Netanyahu, who is carrying out this secular plan from Oded Yanon and even further back, of course, like I said earlier, all the way to Jabotinsky. I would recommend you to go look at the 12 or 13 points or whatever it is of the Lehi group. they go through it really, really carefully and explain exactly what you're seeing with all this, with this plan that I'm talking about, with what we call the Oded Yanan, or Greater Israel Plan, but really it goes back much further than that. And then there's this catch-all far-right grouping called United Right or something like that, and these are just individuals or small groups who manage to win a total of 5 seats. And what we're seeing here is the intersecting of people like Netanyahu and Likud with the Orthodox and with these other folks. They all overlap, and they overlap to the degree that they have no use for Arabs in Israeli territory. They have no use for Arabs in the non-Jordanian, non-Iraqi, non-Lebanese, non-Syrian, and non-Egyptian territories that Israel borders. So Gaza and the West Bank I'm talking about. They've really got no use for those people, and they all essentially agree that they should be pushed, through whatever methods present themselves, and that those areas should be filled with Jews, which is what the settlers do, what the settlers are for. So, I know we've run on for quite a while here, but what I want to say to flesh this out a little bit more is that you got 55 seats of people that I think are either implicit or explicitly implementing a program of ethno-racial religious supremacy. And then you got 50 people who aren't quite so much supremacists, but they still are very strongly nationalist and not willing to make too many compromises. So backtracking to Benny Gantz just for a second, because he's the other big, really solid grouping right now after this election. He and his party said that they would be willing to go into peace talks with the Palestinians, but if you look at the things that they outline that would be necessary for that to happen, they're impossible. Like, for example, the Palestinians would have to give up all rights to their own security, and so you can't have an agreement of peers in which one party has all of the has the exclusive right to violence. The relationship between you and the state of which you are a citizen is not an equal relationship. One is clearly superior, and that's kind of the relationship that Gantz and the blue and white people wanted to have with the Palestinians as a prerequisite for peace talks. So that's something that can't be agreed to, and therefore they're not really serious about meeting them in the middle somewhere to actually obtain peace. So even though I don't think that the Gantz grouping is, they're not explicitly supremacist, and maybe they're not even supremacist, they are still so strongly nationalist that there's not really any ground for agreement. A good case study would be comparing this situation here between these guys and the Palestinian leadership to National Socialist Germany and Poland over the Danzig corridor, and just how you deal with having fundamental arguments over territory between a government that is basically unwilling or unable to make certain concessions, but we'll leave that aside. So you've got 105 seats of people who are either supremacist or firmly nationalist, and then you've got another 10 seats of people who are nationalist, even to the extent that they're probably more willing to make concessions. Okay, I don't know if this was too interesting or useful to you, but I've been thinking quite a bit about this election, so I thought I would offer these comments. Thank you for your time.